So I was recently sent a copy of Black Cairn Point by Claire McFall by Hotkey Publishing. Now, this is a young adult horror thriller set in my very own Scotland. Now, I wasn't surprised to hear that this creepy book had chosen Scotland as its setting, because it seems to me that no matter where I turn in Scotland, there is a spooky story or a ghost story or a real life horror story. Maybe it's something about the Scottish scenery, maybe it's something about my ancestors, but we certainly seem to have inspired a lot of fear and ghostly tales. So of course I was excited to read this one. I love both the genre and also picking up literature that's set in my home country. And to me this book just stood out as being part of a long tradition of spooky, creepy horror books set in Scotland. So I thought I would do a video on that entire topic itself and look at some of the previous books and scary stories that have come before this one before giving you a brief review of this one as the latest in a long line of Scottish horror stories. And I do want to add here that Hotkey were kind enough to offer to sponsor this video, so just so you know, this is a sponsored video, but all of the opinions and the content in it are my own. Now, like I said, it feels like I only have to turn a corner in Scotland to find myself a ghost story. Even when visiting my grandmother in Bo'ness, which is a very small town in Scotland outside of Edinburgh. And in my visits there, I passed by Kinneil House, which was originally built in the 1500s. Now this large and stately home has inspired itself its own ghost story about a young woman who fell to her death in the 17th century, and her ghost was thus named the White Lady, and she has brought much attention to the house itself, and the story of the house is even recorded in one of the letters of the author Maria Edgeworth. The story goes that the lady was in an unhappy marriage, forced to be married to a man she did not wish to be married to, and was kept closed up in her home until one day, managing to escape in her white nightdress, she tried to flee from her captive space and fell to her death down the grand staircase, and has ever since haunted Kinneil House. If you want to know more about the stories and the sites I'm talking about, then of course I will link them down in the description box, so check for all of those down there. But even closer to home, in my own hometown or home city, Edinburgh, there is a very creepy story which has inspired authors over time, and that is the story of Burke and Hare, which is an undoubtedly true story and a real court case in which Burke and Hare were two grave robbers who robbed graves to steal bodies to sell to medical practitioners to dissect, and after a while robbing graves just seemed like too much work for Burke and Hare, and they decided to start murdering their victims and getting their bodies that way. They picked victims that they didn't think anyone would notice going missing and instead sold those bodies to the medical institution. And this story has in fact inspired a story in itself, and that is the Body Snatchers by Robert Louis Stevenson, who is in fact Scottish, and you may know him as the author of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Treasure Island amongst others. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde being a scary story in itself, although not set in Scotland. But you can see that Stevenson definitely liked his creepy ghost stories. This little edition is published by Gallybeggar Press and is part of a little collection of short ghost stories, and this one, like I said, is called The Body Snatcher and is inspired by the true story of Burke and Hare. Now, one of the scary stories that fascinated me as a child and I used to read about in my books when I was younger is one that people are unsure of whether it's true or not. It is unlikely that it is a true story. It is one of those myths and legends that is almost turned into history in Scotland, and that is the story of Sawney Bean. Now, the story of Sawney Bean is in both of these stories here, which kind of gives you an idea of how it's been confused between history and mythology. This is a book of Scottish myths and legends published by Lomond Books by Judy Hamilton, and Scottish Murders, also published by Lomond Books. Now, I bought these when I was in my early teens, when I was actually on holiday in Scotland up in the Highlands, which is a very spooky place, and my friend Misha and I decided to pick these up and we would read them to each other in this kind of deserted Scottish Highlands and get a little bit of a fright. And like I said, Sawney Bean is in both of these books, both in the myths and legends and both in the Scottish Murders. Now, Sawney Bean was a legendary cannibal who lived in the Highlands of Scotland. He and his female partner in crime decided to start having children. I don't know if it was a conscious decision in saying that. And this was the beginning of the Bean family, who were obviously the descendants of Sawney Bean and his partner, and they were an incestuous bunch, although not real, and lived kind of like mad people up in the Highlands in caves, breeding and keeping an eye on the highway as waiting for carts travelling between villages and going to the markets and abducting people to eat. Now this story terrified me when I was younger. There's something about it, if it's told in the right way, that really sets your spine a tingle. And there are many other similar stories in these, both true and not so true, and those in between. And you also find the story of Burke and Hare in Scottish Murders, and it doesn't seem to matter whether you're in the deserted Highlands or the busy cities of Glasgow or Edinburgh, there seems to be a scary story. But having travelled through a lot of Scotland, along the coast, through the Highlands, I can definitely see what has kind of inspired this creepy setting. There is something about the Scottish scenery that really does it for a ghost story. And in fact, the mill of ghost stories and horror stories set in Scotland seems to have no end. Another collection is Scottish Ghost Stories by James Robertson. Now, this copy is published by Sphere and was first published in Great Britain in 1996. Unfortunately, I cannot read you all of the stories in this or tell you all of the creepy Scottish stories there are, because this video would never end. Although I'd be more than happy to do individual videos for some scary Scottish horror stories if you're interested. But just to let you know some of the books that are out there. Some books that you may be more familiar with and are entire novels and demonstrate the power and prominence of the Scottish setting for scary books include Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which is not entirely set in Scotland but does take place partially in the Orkney Islands, which are right at the top of Scotland and, like you might have guessed, islands. Again, these rural and deserted settings out at sea have managed to make their way into one of the classic horror novels of our time. And books like Frankenstein have then gone on to inspire further works like the third in Megan Shepherd's The Madman's Daughter trilogy, A Cold Legacy, which is inspired by and is an interpretation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and is again a young adult horror or thriller or creepy suspense novel. There's so many words you can use, which I feel like brings us back quite nicely to Black Cairn Point. Now, I have slowly become quite a big fan of the young adult horror genre. There's something about young adult horror that really appeals to me, and something I've noticed the more I've read in this genre, and also from reading Black Cairn Point, is how strikingly they feel like they would be very appropriate as horror films. There's something that I feel like just translates very well there, and I think if you like things like the Madman's Daughter trilogy or Anna Dressed in Blood or Say Her Name by James Dawson, which I also loved, then I think you will enjoy this book. Now, the premise is that it follows a young girl called Heather, who's just finished her 5th year of secondary school in Scotland. Now, in Scotland, you can go on to do your 6th year, or you can leave after 5th year or 4th year, depending on how many qualifications you get. But I'm not going to go into the Scottish school system because it's not really that important. But Heather is going on a birthday camping trip for her friend Doogie's birthday with 4 of her other friends. Now, Doogie wants to visit this Black Cairn Point, which his father used to visit when he was younger and is along the coast on a beach. The perfect creepy setting, in my opinion. And whilst they're out there, they disturb a pagan burial site at this cairn. And things go on from there. Now, I don't want to spoil anything, because the thing about horror and suspense novels is the unknowing, is the not knowing, and that's what makes it creepy. I think one of the things that really adds to the creep in this book, though, is the fact that it switches between time. So you begin this book meeting Heather in a mental hospital. It is after the events of is after the events that occurred at Black Cairn Point, and you don't know what happened. You don't know why she's in this mental hospital. You don't know what became of her 4 friends or anything along those lines, what happened on the camping trip. Every time you feel like you're about to learn something from Heather in these flash forwards to the mental hospital, we go backwards and we're back on the camping trip and we experience things for ourselves. And I think that makes you all the more intrigued and interesting as to what's going on, and makes it all the more jumpy and disconcerting. I really like the author's technique of doing that. I think that really added to the horror vibe, which was the intention, I imagine. It makes it all the more real because it takes it out of this deserted setting at the beach, away from anybody else, and we see that other people don't believe that something kind of horrific and ghostly happened and that something more normal and human must have happened. One of the other things I really liked about this book, and may just be something that is a Scottish thing, it may apply to the rest of you in the UK, it may apply to those of you outside of the UK, but for me, other than the horror aspects, if I took those out, this book just felt like such an accurate representation of teenage high school life in Scotland. I was reading this book thinking, this is eerily similar to what my experience of secondary school was. Not to mention that our main character Heather has just been accepted for a place at university to study archaeology, which was like an added creep factor for me, because when I was leaving school I was going to university to study classical archaeology, and I did find that a little bit unnerving, but obviously it's not going to apply to everybody, but for me it was really unsettling, and obviously that's what I wanted from this book. It's just so similar to what I remember it was like being a teenager in the UK, so I really like that. I really like that element of realism. I really felt like this could be me, I could be there with my friends, this could be happening to me, and it made then the horror aspects, the unreal aspects, all that more terrifying because it was combined with this realism. Now, I'm not crazy, I don't think young adult horror is a genre for everybody, but I really enjoy it, and I think if you enjoy thriller horror films, especially films like the Scream series, if you like TV shows like Supernatural, and you've not read any YA horror, then I'd highly recommend checking them out. And this one is really, really good. It is top notch in its genre, and I really enjoyed it, and it really gave me the heebie-jeebies, which was what it was meant to do. And I feel like Claire McFall has just added herself to a long running tradition in Scotland of scary ghost stories, and I tip my hat off to her. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed the slightly different format and little additions to this review. Until next time guys, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye! Warlocks and witches in a dance, nae coalition brent new fae France, but hornpipes, jigs, strathspeys and reels, put life and metal in their heels. A winnock bunker in the east, their sattled nick and shape o' beast. A towsy tyke, black grim and large, to gie them music was his charge. He screwed the pipes and gart them skirl, till roof and rafters aye did dirl. Coffins stood round like open presses, that shod the dead in their last dresses. And by some devilish cantrap sleight, each in its cauld hand held a light, by which heroic Tam was able to note upon the haly table a murderer's banes in gibbet airns, twa span lang wee unchristianed bairns, a thief new cutted fae a rape, wi' his last gasp his gab did gape. 5 tomahawks wi' blue red rusted, 5 scimitars wi' murder crusted, a garter which a babe had strangled, a knife a father's throat had mangled, whom his ain son o' life bereft, the grey hairs yet stack to the heft, wi' mair o' horrible and awfy, which even to name was to be unlawfy. 3 lawyers' tongues turned inside out, wi' lies seemed like a beggar's clout. 3 priests' hearts rotten black as muck, lay stinking vile in ever nook.